Hi, I'm Mark Rosano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network. Today on this edition of Conversations, we're joined by Tim Beims, where we were honored to be able to write an article for the AOGR, and he'll go through what that is, what his background is. But Matt and I were able to write about supply demand in the oil field service, which is an interesting time, just given where we are in energy. So I'll turn it over to Tim. He'll introduce himself, and then we'll start talking about what's happening in the world today.
Thanks, Mark. Really appreciate you having me here this morning. My name's Tim Beims, and I'm the senior technology editor with the American Oil and Gas Reporter. It's a position I've had for 26 years. So when I came into this business, it was still very much a conventional world, and deep water was 800 feet. So that's how long I've been kicking around the oil and gas industry. The magazine, our focus is U.S. based independence. So what that has meant over my career is that we've seen most of those companies, particularly the mid-sized and up, move from vertical onshore plays, largely gas plays, but also conventional oil plays. First, a lot of those companies moved into the Gulf of Mexico offshore environment at the same time that they were moving into international plays all over the world. And then, the most colossal event, the most significant event in my career that I've observed in the industry happened in the early 2000s when George Mitchell made the Barnett Shale go, and that changed everything. So that arc from the early 2000s today has really just been all around unconventional resource plays.
Well, that's great. Some of the things that we've been talking about, now that we're starting to see some of this consolidation pick up, what are some of the things that when you talk to, individuals throughout the industry, what are you hearing in terms of some of this consolidation? Or do you think it's going to kind of pick up into year end, or is this something we're going to have to see a bit more pain in the market as we get into that 2021?
That's a great question. And I think one of the differentiators here is size. I think that big enough, you're going to be a buyer, whether that is on the corporate level, or whether that is picking up assets that complement existing portfolios. And then on the other end of that spectrum are the small private players. And in many cases, those companies are well capitalized, and their projects are of a scale that they are able to invest and make decent returns, even at today's prices. We have a story in our upcoming October issue that profiles 3 of those small private players, and they're drilling. They're drilling, completing. Now it's not 100 wells. It's a well, a pad, or in one case, a couple of wells a month type of scenario. But they are trying to get back to work. But Mark, I don't think there's any doubt that we're going to see some kind of consolidation going forward. And I hope it doesn't mean that there's more pain that's necessary to get us there. Right. I hope we start seeing opportunistic types of deals. And if you're in unconventional plays, I think scale is going to matter more than ever going forward.
Now, not to give away too much, you talk about these 3 private operators, and we're starting to see that more, where everyone keeps talking about, well, we should go lower, but we're not. Why is that? And I think there's a little bit of a misunderstanding as to what are some of the privates doing? What kind of feedstock do the refiners continue to need? What does this look like? But when you're talking about these 3 players, what basins are they in? Can you give some color in terms of where are they operating? What kind of opportunities are they seeing at this point?
Yeah, absolutely. One of them is a small family-owned company that has made a conventional gas discovery in the Valle Verde Basin, south of the Permian.
Okay.
And it's a Strawn formation discovery, so it's conventional at about 12,500 feet. The other 2 are in the DJ Basin, in the northern Colorado Niobrara play, and some interesting theories around their their developments. One of them, for example, has applied tracers to understand exactly how how efficient their completions are and where the fractures are going. Got some interesting insights. And then one of the companies is there's the multiple benches in the Niobrara, and they are fracturing in the Niobrara B, which they're seeing fracture growth up into the A. So rather than fracturing in both of those zones, they're taking a stack play concept, fracturing in one zone with the idea that you're draining both. Again, these aren't 100 well development projects. One company's case, it was 2 pads with 4 wells each. The other one, the article really talks about the initial well that they drilled the first of planned, I think 7 on one pad and 7 on the other. For the size of the company, they're significant projects, and they are using best available technology, which I think is another key differentiator going forward.
Right. And for those that don't know fracking that well, just to give you some color, if you try to frack in the B and then you try to frack again in the A, even though there's communication, you'd lose pressure in both. So the idea is trying to do those tracers, do the work, so then you're not losing production, losing pressure, and those are ways to help try to strengthen your total recoveries. But now, like you bring up a great point and a great pivot kind of into Colorado as we start to head into the election cycle. We've seen them on multiple occasions put something out there to try to ban fracking, do some setbacks. As you start to look at some of this in terms of where the setbacks are going to kind of shake out, I mean, did they give any kind of color around that? Do you have any kind of insight in terms of how do you think this can go as we go into November and some of the ballots that are on the agenda?
Mark, I don't have any answers. In general, when you talk to producers in the state of Colorado, it's just this building anti-fossil fuel sentiment that is getting increasingly difficult to cope with, particularly in the Greeley area. And in many cases, the industry has done all the right things in terms of applying approaches that would minimize noise and dust and any kind of environmental impact. They've done the right thing in terms of trying to engage the community, to inform them and educate them exactly, what drilling and fracturing entails, and to take every measure to do so safely. But that crescendo is still building, and I don't know how you stem the tide at this point. I think in most cases you have organizations like the Colorado Oil and Gas Association, COGA, who represents oil and gas companies in the state, and they're engaged literally around the clock in trying to just keep abreast of what's happening in terms of how it impacts their members. And it's just, as I said, the tide just keeps rising, and I don't know how it ends, but the election cycle trends have been pretty clear too. So hopefully it's somehow, some way, reason prevails.
Yeah, it's always tough when you have some of the politics. They continue in one direction, and even though they're uneconomic until the point of pain, and then all of a sudden they decide to adjust, and hopefully it's not too late. The problem with Colorado is it's fairly easy to get on the ballot, depending on the rules and regulations. And when I talk to people there, they always say, look, it's people outside the state, like people within the state want it, need it. A lot of jobs come from it. And they end up joking that this is essentially just a form of stimulus from Wyoming. And because if it was to happen here, people would shift over. So it's not that it would stop. It's just it would go into a different state, and they would try to, carry over some of this opportunity. It is frustrating for sure. But when you talk about, natural gas. So, we've seen some of the benefits with the back end of the curve, specifically in natural gas. And now you have some conventional plays that you mentioned in the Permian. And, we see a lot of gas production, but at the same time, there's a lot of bottlenecks. I mean, What are some of the opportunities that you're hearing about or seeing in terms of maybe getting a little bit further away from the Appalachia, trying to capture maybe some of the dry gas in southern Oklahoma, potentially now in Texas, to try to capture and get away from these bottlenecks that we keep seeing and coming from the Northeast?
Right, and that is, I think, probably the most monolithic issue in the Northeast is pipeline access, and again, we see that kind of just anti-fossil fuel attitude. And the concerning thing, Mark, to me, as I've watched this, is that there's always opposition, and opposition can be healthy. The more we debate and analyze issues, generally, the more we scrutinize them, and that usually leads to a better decision at the end. But we're seeing this divide up here, where it's, on one side, it's just absolutely nothing anywhere at any time. And there, I don't know how you counteract that. It's really just shut it all down. And we've seen some examples in California this summer of what happens when you develop policies around purely environmental aims without consideration for the practical realities. And the practical reality is that oil and natural gas need to be any part of a sustainable economic growth situation for this nation and around the world. Right. But that message just, in certain places, just does not play. It's what plays is an anti-fossil fuel message. But on natural gas, we're definitely seeing companies who can pivot to natural gas. There's a lot of optimism about the upcoming winter heating season. I was just reading some analysis yesterday that forecasts a total withdrawal cycle from November 1st to March 30th, over the winter months, that could meet or exceed what we saw in the winter of 2013-14 during the infamous polar vortex winter. And I think that year we went from 3.8 or 3.8 TCF to start a winter, and drew storage all the way down to a little under 1 TCF. Right. So that had a significant impact. Unfortunately, the next winter was very mild, and we saw storage build again. But storage is always key around natural gas prices, and it looks like we're going to start the winter somewhere in that 4 TCF, 3.94 TCF range. So it'll be very interesting to watch, among other things, how the COVID patterns and the stay-at-home patterns for people who are working and schooling from home, how that impacts the demand picture. Obviously, we've lost demand in some areas, but some of the initial studies I've seen on this, the residential demand more than makes up for some of the lost demand in areas that we've seen, like in the industrial markets or the commercial markets. So it'll be very intriguing to watch how that plays out over the winter. As far as the natural gas development activity, the Marcellus Appalachia is still the giant in the room, no doubt about it. And they're the ones with the ability to bring a significant amount of supply on in the shortest amount of time at a very low cost. But as you mentioned, it's the pipeline access issues. It doesn't do any good to develop it if you can't get it to market. So, we're seeing particularly mid-size and smaller independents in places like South Texas and East Texas, around the Haynesville Shale. That's another area that we've actually seen rig count slide a little bit, which caught a lot of people by surprise. But I think the Haynesville is probably very well positioned going forward. And again, we talked about private companies. That's a play that is dominated by private companies with very strong private equity backing. So they have the resources at their disposal, and they're very, very good at drilling these wells 100% in zone, drilling them quickly, using the best available technology to complete them and get really prolific, high producing wells that can deliver a significant amount of gas. And the fact that they're so regionally connected to the Gulf Coast markets is another huge advantage for the Haynesville.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of good points that I think is worth highlighting. Is one, the checks and balances. That we've always needed checks and balances. You always need to make sure where, some guys may like to cut corners or may like to get things done quicker. And then you need an agency to say, yeah, are you sure? Did you do that right? You need someone on the other side to make sure. No, I didn't cut down more trees than I had to. I made sure to do everything, which is good. I mean, that's what we need. We need that check to make sure that we're doing things right by not only the populace and the community, but also obviously the environment. But the other key piece when you talk about 2013, 2014, and the amount of demand is we really didn't have LNG going off the coast and exporting at the levels that we have today. I mean, there were points prior to all of the different hiccups and obviously COVID that resulted, we were pushing 10 BCF a day that was exiting the US. And when you look at, what should we average, it's going to be anywhere between 6 BCF a day and 8 BCF a day, which are just billion cubic feet per day, which is massive when you consider the amount of production that's really kind of fallen off with the amount of oil production that has fallen. And it'll be a unique time in terms of, well, what is going to happen with COVID and how is this adjusting? And when we look in the US, we can see that power demand is really pretty stable, to your point on losing industrial, but picking up that residential. And now as we pivot, some of the other things that we're seeing is propane, like propane, LPG continues to be in high demand, not only for cooking fuel, but obviously we have an increase in chemical capacity. And there's these different pieces in terms of what's happening with propane, what's happening with natural gas, which is definitely interesting. And if you look at, the COVID being a real test, I mean, LPG passed with flying colors when you consider the amount of propane and liquids we have in the US and where that demand centers are. And India is right back to a growth profile. And, as I may not agree with OPEC on oil growth, but I do agree on the condensate and NGL growth, which is, I think, going to play well for some of the positions within the US at this point in time.
Absolutely, and you're right. LNG is a huge lift for the domestic industry, and it was kind of funny to watch. It was kind of funny, but it was also kind of alarming to watch as LNG facilities were developed. We see the first one come on. There was a lot of anticipation that when Sabine Pass comes on, we'll have 2 BCF a day of new demand, or and then incrementally that demand grows. Was scheduled to grow, and it has, but incrementally the supply has outpaced that demand growth all the way around LNG and every other area. So the inactivity in terms of new oil well development and the loss of associated gas, particularly in the Permian, is one of the drivers behind the improving fundamentals for natural gas going into 2021. And it's one of those situations where unfortunately it comes at the cost of oil producers, but the natural gas market should be stronger, largely because of that associated gas piece. Right. We're seeing estimates anywhere from 6 to 9 Bs a day of the production declines by the time we hit the end of winter, mostly from associated gas.
Mm-hmm. And when you look at LNG demand and that shift, when you talk about the U.S. potentially having that colder winter, that would play well into Europe having a colder winter, because when you look at TTF and some of these pricings in Europe, things just don't look as positive as you'd like when you consider about where some of this flow can go through, and it'd be nice to see some of that, loosen up a bit and get some of that flow going into Europe again. But you bring up a good point with associated gas and coming back full circle to some of these mergers and some of these potential consolidations. You look at Conoco. Conoco's done very well in terms of good positioning, strong assets, and now they also have splitters, which are just inherently upgraders, which then they can kind of strip out some of the excess gas, some of the excess condensate, and then sell that on a different stream, which seems to be a better play. When you look out and you start to look at some of these consolidations and some of these ways to say, generate additional capital or close some of these gaps, I mean, what are you hearing or talking with in terms of this opportunity to either build new infrastructure or maybe optimize the infrastructure out there, or selling it to maybe private equity, something that maybe you're hearing that might be a little different or might give some direction as to who's going to consolidate with who to try to optimize some of this infrastructure?
Sure. And again, I think you have to differentiate between the midstream and the upstream.
Mm-hmm.
I think the value drivers are very different for both of those scenarios. And and the midstream is very different. Are you looking at the Northeast? Or are you looking at West Texas? The huge infrastructure expansion that happened across the Permian Basin for the last 5 or 6 years. We're seeing pipelines now concerned about being able to have sufficient supply for all this new capacity that's come on. So just overnight, we went from a capacity constrained environment to where pipelines are now thinking we may have to scramble to make sure our pipelines are running at 80-90% capacity.
Right.
We're not, don't have empty pipe. So, and again, that situation can change very, very quickly as prices recover, or we could find ourselves back to some kind of constrained situation. But it's really all around I think that opportunity is really all around where they see supply growth coming. That's really no different than it ever has been. But I think one of the things that we've seen now is there's always been a balancing act between building new capacity to make sure that we get gas to market for midstream companies versus, on the other hand, overbuilding and having a pipeline that's idled or that's not running at full capacity. I think that risk reward balance has been emphasized by what we've just seen with COVID and the downturn in the Permian Basin. So I think that's one of the things that may be a bit of a headwind for not just any kind of new construction that may still be on the board, but for the consolidation space, it's just really careful scrutiny of the risk of even an asset in place. What does the longer term supply picture look like around those assets?
Right. And when you talk about, my joke was in 2018, we broke the Permian, where we really just figured out, where can we drive this and what's going to be the problem? And 2018 was that issue. And we saw differentials blow out, which, created this huge gap. And then there was always that push to kind of build more. And now, as you said, we've already seen, stories and companies coming out and cutting pricing just to keep that volume going through, which at times isn't appreciated when you consider about what is the overall cost to get that oil, gas, liquids to market. And when you have pipelines essentially cutting pricing, it's going to help the underlying picture in terms of trying to keep some of this flow going, as you talked about, maintaining pressure, maintaining a certain amount of volume. And when you evaluate these different companies, it's what is their firm transport? What have they agreed to purchase? What have they agreed to do? Because on a firm transport level, whether or not you use the pipe, you're paying for it. So you want to try to optimize the best way you can to make sure that you're not just, drilling for the sake of drilling because it's cheaper, or you lose less money drilling and filling the pipe than just paying outright. So those are the different pieces of the pie that are interesting when you start talking about consolidation, kind of where this is going. And the one thing when we look at, recovering oil in place, you've been in the industry a long time. You've seen the growth of technology. I mean, what kind of interesting things are you starting to see or hear in terms of, new innovations that are maybe being deployed now or right on the cusp of being deployed because of their proven record of being effective?
Right. If you went back to the late 80s, early 90s, you saw, this game-changing technology, 3D seismic, come along. And it really just completely changed everything about the industry. And it certainly changed its metrics in terms of its success rates and all of those kind of metrics. I don't see anything like that. I don't see that one technology that's going to really change the game. Since late 2014, 2015, as you know, the push has been efficiency across the board in every aspect of operations. But you get a sense when you look at things today that sponge has been wrung almost dry. And there's not a lot more efficiency that you can see in a drilling operation. We're drilling wells now, horizontal wells that were taking 30, 40 days 5 years ago in 3 and 4 days now. And that's just an astonishing improvement in drilling times. And the same thing is happening in the completion side. Extremely efficient, safe operations. So, I think what we're going to see going forward is, particularly as operators rely more and more on their existing producing wells to generate the cash flow to develop new wells. I think we're going to see, as you mentioned, that recovery factor play really large. And part of that is making sure on the front end that you are completing the wells properly, to make sure you have the ability to maximize recovery over time. And I think we're going to see a lot of diagnostics come into play. I mentioned tracers earlier. I think we're going to see tracers, technologies like microseismic to really map where the fractures are and understand those interactions are going to continue to be very important. And I think the end objective here is to get to engineered completions as a standard operating practice.
Right.
So you're making adjustments in real time based on what the formation is giving you, and you're doing it by formation, by perforation, by stage, all the way down the length of the lateral. And that was a very expensive proposition, again, going back 5 or 6 years, but that's starting to become more and more routine. And the results are certainly showing that the investment in an engineered completion approach is paying dividends in terms of the production and the long-term recovery rates. And then the other aspect of all of that to maximizing those recovery rates is what happens once that well starts producing. So, you've seen, for example, in the Permian, these high initial productivity wells will come on an ESP, and then as that production declines, you start shifting to other kinds of artificial lift systems. So I think we're going to put more attention than we have in a very long time on the production process itself, and making sure that we're maintaining optimal flow rates initially, in terms of how the choke volume is managed, and then the type of artificial lift system and how that is impacting the reservoir's productivity over time. Because, Mark, if you can increase recovery factors by just a small percentage, 2%, 3%, it's significant. It's that uplift you get in return over time is incredible. You can essentially get 2 well production for 1, if you can manage to increase that recovery factor a little.
Right. One of the jokes that when I was talking to a drilling company, and we were discussing about the speed in which they're drilling, I was like, is there a point in which you just can't go much faster? And they're like, we've reached it. Friction is real, the alloys are specific, and if we go much faster, we'll literally melt the equipment. And there's just no, so there's then been that optimization top hole and then actually drilling the well itself. But as you said, the completion side still has a long ways to go when you consider about, recovering the oil in place or the gas in place, in terms of maximizing. And I think Halliburton had it where it was like an increase of 1% recovery rate across the world. It would cover, the oil demand for 2 to 3 years. And just that's why there's been this big push to try to create that efficiency. And one of the other ones that we're starting to hear more and more about is that dual stimulation, where in the past you would shut one well, complete the other, then open them both back up. But now you're seeing where you can actually complete 2 at the same time. And that's coming back down to that efficiency, that's those tracking, and coming all the way full circle to our comments about communication, and realizing that there isn't the communication that you initially thought, and that you can optimize the people on the ground. And when we start looking at some of the consolidation, because we talked about the E&P, but then we obviously had Liberty and Schlumberger, and we had some consolidation there. I mean, when you start looking at some of these efficiencies on the oil field service side, we talked about tracers. I mean, what are we seeing in terms of just horsepower and maybe optimizing on that level, and kind of what are you seeing in terms of some of these maybe mergers or JVs to try to bridge the gap to get to the other side?
Yeah, Mark, you have your finger on that pulse, but much closer than I do. I see everything, I guess, from the operator perspective, and the operator's concern is the ability to get a frac crew on location when they need it, and to get a good frac crew on location when they need it. Right. So, for them, and they always have preferred providers. And, I mentioned the 2 companies in the Niobrara, and they both have a preferred services provider. And what distinguishes that preferred provider from, companies B, C, and D is they get more efficiencies when they use that particular company. Right. So exactly what we just mentioned, if they can get their wells fractured and flowing back in, X days instead of X days plus one, they're going to choose X days. It's that efficiency push again. So, I don't really have any insights for you in terms of, what I'm hearing in terms of mergers or JVs, but as you know, the industry's been through these up and down cycles many times in the past. I don't know that we've seen any more challenging ones than this one. This is unlike anything we've ever encountered, but the JV, the ability to partner with other companies or combine forces with other companies, that's typically been a response in these kinds of times when your margins are challenged. Right. And so I expect to see that for sure. I think we're going to see that among the mid-sized operators. We're going to see that among particularly mid-sized service companies. But, what it essentially did was create by merging with Liberty, the combined entity creates a large new technology service provider. Mm-hmm. So I guess when you look at the past up and down cycles, you initially see that kind of consolidation of companies coming together to form larger entities to deal with the depressed market conditions. But when things turn, you see exactly the opposite. You see all of these new startup companies in that same space. So one day, God willing, it's sooner rather than later, when we see oil prices recover, I would expect to see a number of small regional frac companies, partly because that space has now been created through that merger.
Right. And it's when you talk about those small privates, it's important to understand that when you have a private company that's completing, let's call it 5 wells in a quarter versus a large public that's maybe completing 45 or 50, you're going to see that pain much clearer. It'll hit numbers very right there. You're just spreading that inefficiency across a smaller amount of wells, which just hits right where it hurts at the bottom line. So that's one of those big things. But you bring up a good point when you talked about seismic and what we're learning while we're doing it, and there seems to be a certain amount of consistency with transferring that to other crews, or at least having a certain amount within the corporation itself, as we've seen a lot of these cloud computing and a lot of these mergers, or at least discussions and contracts with some of the AI providers, or Microsoft, IBM, Amazon, to try to come up with solutions to create this across whole companies so that you can kind of leverage the knowledge that you're gaining for every well, especially because now we have thousands and thousands of wells in a database, and you can start to see consistencies. You run machine learning over it. All of a sudden, you're picking up things that you may not have noticed as a human, but you're getting them called out. And if you're an expert in geology and that engineer, the reservoir engineer, you're starting to learn a little bit more and getting closer to that end goal, or as we talk about it at Primary Vision, closer to the bullseye of this is how I can get an extra 2% from this well or 5% from this well, because it's meaningful. And when you look at creating that efficiency, one of the bigger pushes, and this will lead into the question, we oversaturated the market with light sweet crude. We got to a point where we were pumping 13.1 million barrels a day, and there just wasn't this ability to process that kind of oil. But now as we get closer to this 10.5 million, it seems to be that there's a little bit more of a swing factor where this is a bit more sustainable. But when you talked about, we started offshore, then we came onshore. I mean, are you starting to see maybe that pendulum swing a little bit and getting a little bit more into the offshore space, just based on the quality of oil out there, the need for maybe some of that heavier sour or at least medium sweet, as we see new refining coming on, especially in MENA or the Middle East, North Africa, and Asia at this point?
I'm really not seeing that yet. And again, our focus is U.S. based companies. Mm-hmm. And, at this point, we're just not seeing a lot of movement in the offshore period.
Right.
But that, again, I think you bring up a good point, and I think that as we recover and emerge out of this deep down cycle, that we'll see opportunities emerging in a lot of places, and the Gulf of Mexico is going to be one of those places. And really, the focus has been off the Gulf of Mexico for at least 10 years now.
Right.
You look at a lot of the leading onshore shell players; those same companies were leading deepwater players 10 years ago, and they completely shifted their focus into resource plays. So they had the expertise, they had the understanding, and that's a situation where I could see some of those companies putting at least part of their operational focus back into deep water,
Right.
Gulf of Mexico for sure, and maybe taking some of that single play focus and diversifying a little bit. And I think this downturn, that may be one of the lessons that we take out of this, is that having that single basin focus is fantastic in terms of building the expertise and building that efficiency we've talked about. But diversifying that asset base may be a smarter play in the long run.
Right.
And you mentioned machine learning and artificial intelligence, and I'm right there with you. I think those are such powerful enabling tools. The industry's gotten very good at collecting, acquiring data of all types. We have sensors and everything on the well site today, but are we analyzing that data the way it should be analyzed? Are we extracting value from that data? And, I think back, I wrote a story 4 or 5 years ago with a couple of really bright geophysicists, and they were at that time really trying to understand, how do we apply particularly machine learning to large data sets, seismic data sets, to help us do our jobs better and faster. And, they really zeroed in around the ability to recognize patterns in very, very large data sets, and kind of do a lot of the legwork, a lot of the busy work that they would have been doing, rely on the machines to do that, do it very efficiently, very quickly. And that left them to really maximize their time on the part of the process that added the value. So I think we're going to see that more and more, where we're taking particularly repetitive tasks, repetitive information, and we're going to use automation as much as possible, and analytics, machine learning as much as possible, to try to extract maximum value from the information we already have. It already exists. Right. It's just a matter of getting business intelligence from it.
So, and we've talked about recovering more from the actual reservoir, but I mean, what's your thoughts on using some of this information to actually adjust the decline curves? I mean, it's very well known that there's high decline curves in the onshore space, specifically shale. I mean, have you seen anything, or have you talked to anyone about, we're doing this, and instead of the decline curve being 28%, it's now 18% because we're managing it differently, or something that we're learning a bit more to try to help adjust kind of what we're actually getting from these wells, and how are we maximizing to mitigate against some of these massive declines that we see after an 18, 24-month period?
Right. And those declines have actually increased over time. As the higher the IP, the steeper the drop off has been. And we talked about the because of constrained capital access, the need to rely on your existing wells, the production from your existing wells, to generate the cash flows to then go drill and complete new wells. And that challenge is exacerbated by those steep decline curves. So if everything that we've always believed about decline curves to be true are true, we should start seeing some meaningful declines coming in the few months ahead here. We're now down to 6 months of significantly reduced new well activity, which means that most of the producing wells are now 6 months or older. And as you mentioned, those drop-offs over the first 6 to 12 months are very steep. So how you manage that up to this point has really been largely about just adjusting how you produce the well from initial flowback, managing the chokes, and it's really been a production management technique. I don't know that there's any answers out there to lessening the steepness of the decline curve. I think the bigger point is even if you do have that steep decline curve, what can you do on the backside of that to ultimately increase recovery? Whether that is, flattening the decline curve over time, or whether that is simply, instead of a well falling from 800 barrels a day IP down to 80 barrels a day after 3 years, if after 3 years you can maintain production at 120 barrels a day, or something like that. But I don't know that decline curve's ever going to truly get flattened. It's the nature of the beast in a tight oil or gas shale play. It's part of the fracturing process to prop open the formations. At some point, you're going to have decline curves.
Yeah. The things that we've seen over time is, you've seen the refracts, you've seen workovers, and where in the past you would get kind of this big spike and then it would come right back down to the original decline curve. But to your point, now we're seeing it where we do get that initial spike, but instead of falling back down to the original decline curve, it's now shifted a little bit to the right. So the idea is that you're getting a little bit more from the well. You're just not obviously going back to the original, but you're helping to slow down some of that, where when you get towards the tail, instead of being, like you said, at that 80, you're closer to 100, 120, because you've been able to re-stimulate and pull away some of those paraffins and other things that build up downhole that really kind of impacts where things can go over time. So when we look at that management that you talked about, one of the big points in time for us has been really Q3 of 2021, because when you talk about some of the new wells coming on, some of the trying to manage as much as you can at this point, there's still a little bit of wiggle room, especially at 10.5 million barrels a day. At 13 million barrels a day, there's really nothing. So we've already seen some of those impacts. And now as we go forward, when you start to look at, all right, well, what is the running room? Like, where can we get to before we see these real catch up? And it seems to be this Q3 where Q1, Q2, there's enough ducks out there that are in quality spots that instead of you'll lose less or maybe break even, and then from that point forward, you're going to have to see a resurgence of activity, or there's the decline curve is just going to catch up with you, because there's no way to outrun it at this point. And we're starting to see those mergers and some of those means of optimizing in terms of running room, the consistencies and contiguous acres that kind of helps some of those efficiency gains. But the bigger thing is obviously it's shale and the decline curves, which is why it's interesting when you start to think about, well, how is a company going to manage a corporate decline curve in a, let's call it a lower for longer situation? Or do you think we're heading for that supply shock where there's just not enough investment and you're just going to see not enough supply, we're going to see demand return, and all of a sudden we're going to get a move back to 85, 100 at this point?
That's the $1 million question, and I think you're seeing more and more people start to look around, and this isn't a 5 or 6 month downturn. If you go back and look at international exploration activity, this is an extended period of lower development, lower exploration, where we're simply not bringing on the new reserves to replace what's been lost through depletion, both in shale and conventional reservoirs around the world. And I think you nailed it. It's all about the decline curve. That treadmill should start turning faster and faster the further we get away from that period where we were drilling and completing wells at a sufficient clip to replace the production. That stopped in April or May. So the further we get away from that, and the more that those wells that were completed prior to that age, that treadmill is just going to turn faster and faster. And at some point, as you said, you simply have to initiate new activity, or there's no chance of reversing that decline curve. It just keeps getting faster. So, I never try to predict prices. If I did, if I was good at it, I would, I don't know, an island somewhere, but because I read predictions all the time and they're almost always wrong, sometimes way wrong. But you do see a situation, Mark, that's set up that if demand comes back robustly over next year or so, particularly as we develop a vaccine and it gets distributed, if those pieces start coming back where you see demand beginning to grow again, we have no doubt degraded the supply base. And it's a matter of how long it will take to bring the supply back around to somewhere close to where it was before the world shut down from COVID.
Right.
And we started building this surplus. But again, we do have this surplus, and we have to work through that before you start worrying about shortages of any kind.
So last question before we let you get back to your day. When you look at, we talked a lot about natural gas and natural gas production as well as consumption on a global level. And we haven't seen a lot of oil finds or really that oil exploration, but we've seen a lot of massive gas start to come on from Leviathan on down. I mean, how much of that maybe potential demand for oil has been eroded or been shifted into natural gas? And could that maybe reduce the demand for oil? So we'll get a shock, but instead of it being, let's call it 100, it's 70, because instead of getting to those levels, and I know I'm picking numbers out of thin air because, anyone's guess is as good as mine. It's just a matter of, what are you thinking or seeing when you're considering kind of that balance between oil and natural gas on a go forward level?
Yeah. Well, and you're right. There's no question that gas is the preferred fuel. But I always think back, Mark, whenever I hear discussions about this, to back in the mid 90s, and during the Clinton administration, the Department of Energy was referring to the U.S. industry as the gas and oil industry.
Right.
They were all about gas, and that was the common thought then, is that gas was going to displace oil going forward over the next 10 years. And obviously that didn't happen. But there's no doubt that we see some very strong drivers behind natural gas globally, partly because of the environmental attributes of natural gas, but partly, as you said, is the abundance of supply. And we know that there are stranded resources in various places around the world that with LNG technology can now be mobilized and monetized. So, I don't know any more than anyone else what the future looks like in terms of the gas and oil balance. But, ideally what we would see is growth in both of those areas, but maybe the demand takes slightly different forms. The growth for oil, for example, perhaps you see the demand decline for transportation fuels, but grow in other areas. And I think that is a distinct possibility, is that the demand pull maybe comes from slightly different sectors, but we see incremental growth long-term continue for some time.
Right. Well, Tim, it was an absolute pleasure. Thank you again. You can find him at the American Oil and Gas Reporter, or AOGR.com. So, Tim, it was a pleasure. Thanks again for coming on and not only publishing us, but coming and talking oil and gas. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, anytime. I was glad to do it. And we'll talk about that next article real soon.
Anybody who follows me knows my opinions are long and fast, so I'm never in shortage of something to say or a comment to have. So thanks again. This week you can expect us to have, obviously, our favorite, the EIA show. Then we follow up with the economy show, and then everyone's favorite, the Primary Vision Frac Spread Count. So thanks again for watching. I'm Mark Rossano, founder and CEO of C6 Capital Holdings, coming to you from Primary Vision Network.